I was sitting here with a coffee when I read those 6 words on the screen. 6 words that I genuinely believed were more geopolitically explosive than any of the bombs the United States had been dropping over Iran for the past 31 days. Go get your own oil. Donald Trump posted that on Truth Social at roughly 7 in the morning on March 31st, 2026, directing it at the European allies who had refused to join his war against Iran. And I want to be very clear about something because this matters enormously. That wasn't a slip of the tongue. That wasn't rhetoric. That wasn't a negotiating bluff. That was a statement of strategic philosophy, a declaration of how the most powerful man on the planet understood the relationship between Washington and the alliance it had built, financed, and protected for 8 decades. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, Spain, the countries that had structured their entire post war security architecture around the American guarantee, were being told by the President of the United States to figure it out themselves. The era in which America played the indispensable guardian of the Atlantic world had just been put on notice, and most people watching the news that morning were too distracted by the burning Kuwaiti oil tanker in Dubai harbor to notice what had actually just happened. So let me tell you what actually happened, because this story was bigger than Iran. It was bigger than the Strait of Hormuz. It was bigger than Trump's Truth Social account. This was the moment when the fractures inside the most powerful military alliance in history were dragged into full daylight, and what was visible was not pretty. To understand March 31st, 2026, you had to go back to the morning of February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a massive, coordinated strike campaign against Iran that eliminated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, dozens of senior military commanders, and nuclear and missile facilities across at least 26 of Iran's 31 provinces. It was the boldest unilateral military action the United States had undertaken since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and it was launched without a declaration of war from Congress, without a mandate from the United Nations Security Council, and without so much as a courtesy phone call to the allies of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Not a heads up, not a briefing, not a quiet diplomatic conversation over dinner the night before. Nothing. And that deliberate, contemptuous absence of consultation was the original sin from which everything else followed. Because when the war began and Washington started asking for help, the answer it received from the capitals of Western Europe wasn't what it had expected. The first country to push back was the United Kingdom. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, had initially refused American requests to use British military bases for offensive strikes against Iran. The two bases in question were Diego Garcia, the joint US-UK airbase in the Chagos Islands deep in the Indian Ocean, and RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire, home to America's heavy bomber fleet in Europe. When Washington came calling, Starmer's government lawyers advised that participating in the strikes would place the United Kingdom in an untenable legal position under international law. Starmer agreed with his lawyers. The bases were closed to offensive operations. Trump's reaction was immediate and volcanic. And here is the detail that most people missed in all the noise. The detail that reveals exactly what kind of alliance Washington thought it had with London. Diego Garcia had already become the center of a separate diplomatic dispute. The Starmer government had negotiated in 2024 an agreement returning sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius while retaining a 99-year lease on the base. Trump had blessed the deal at the time. But the moment Starmer refused to open Diego Garcia for strikes on Iran, Trump reversed his position on the Chagos deal entirely. He attacked it on social media. He undermined the ongoing negotiations between Britain and Mauritius. He was using a diplomatic agreement, one he had already formally endorsed, as leverage to punish an ally that hadn't done what he wanted. And then, standing in the Oval Office alongside German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, Trump pointed at a bronze bust of Winston Churchill and said of Keir Starmer, "He ruins relationships." We are very surprised. This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with. 4 words that landed like a verdict. Keir is no Churchill. It was worth pausing on that comparison for a moment because it was loaded with a very specific kind of historical arrogance. Churchill was the man who stood firm when Britain stood alone in 1940. Churchill was the man who co-authored the Atlantic Charter. To invoke Churchill as the standard of adequate Allied behavior, while simultaneously launching a war that Churchill himself would almost certainly have considered reckless without a broader coalition, was a particular kind of audacity. But Starmer held his ground, and he said something in Parliament that became his defining statement on the entire crisis. This government does not believe in regime change from the skies. He told lawmakers that America had expressed its disagreement with Britain's decision not to join the initial strikes, but that it was his duty to judge what was in Britain's national interest. That was the judgment he had made. He stood by it. The complication was that holding the line came with a price. Iran launched 2 ballistic missiles at Diego Garcia, the longest range attack it had conducted in the entire war, fired from more than 4,000 kilometers away. One failed mid-flight. The other was intercepted by an American warship. The base survived, but the message was unmistakable. No base on Earth was beyond reach. And the British public, 59% of whom opposed the Iran war, watched Starmer navigate the tightrope between alliance obligation and national interest with something between relief and anxiety. By early March, Starmer had made a partial concession. He authorized American use of British bases for what he called a specific and limited defensive purpose, destroying Iranian missiles at their launch sites. Not offensive strikes deep into Iran, not regime change operations, defensive, limited, specific. Trump said it had come too late, that Britain's hesitation had cost valuable days. It's taken 3 or 4 days for us to work out where we can land, he complained. It would have been much more convenient. Convenience. That was how the President of the United States described the military geography of the Indian Ocean. It was much more convenient for your ally to open its bases without asking questions. Trump kept coming. He shared a Saturday Night Live UK sketch on social media portraying Starmer as spineless and terrified of American displeasure. "Golly," said the actor, playing the Prime Minister in his recognizable nasal tones. "What if Donald shouts at me?" Trump found it hilarious. Starmer's office declined to comment. People close to the Prime Minister said he had shrugged rather than sulked. He had no interest in a public shouting match with a man who would turn any response into more ammunition. In a Britain where 59% of the public opposed the Iran war, being publicly attacked by Trump for not joining it was not the worst political position to occupy. Now here is where the story gets particularly revealing, and particularly concrete in its consequences. Because while London was navigating its complicated dance with Washington, France, and Spain were making decisions with direct, measurable consequences on the battlefield. And this is where I want you to pay very close attention, because what happened next had no precedent in the history of the Atlantic Alliance. France closed its airspace to any American aircraft engaged in offensive missions against Iran. Not defensive transport, not humanitarian flights. Specifically, combat aircraft flying strike missions. President Macron had said publicly that the American and Israeli strikes had been conducted outside the framework of international law. He was not equivocating. He was not hedging. He was stating a legal position and acting on it with operational consequences. And then Spain went further. Spain's defense minister Margarita Robles announced that Madrid had closed both its military bases and its airspace to any US aircraft involved in the Iran war. The United States maintained joint military facilities in Spain, and those facilities were now off limits for anything related to Operation Epic Fury. This was made perfectly clear to the American military from the very beginning, Robles said. Neither the bases are authorized, nor, of course, is the use of Spanish airspace authorized for any actions related to the war in Iran. She called the war profoundly illegal and profoundly unjust. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said in an interview with Al Jazeera that it was disappointing, that in a difficult moment, Spain, a NATO member that the United States was formally obligated to protect under Article 5, had denied Washington the use of its airspace and was publicly boasting about it. And then Rubio said something that carried the weight of a structural threat. The relationship between the United States and NATO needed to be reviewed because of the alliance's position on the Iran war. Reviewed. That word landed with enormous implications. And then came the image that, for me, captured everything about this moment with a precision that no political speech could match. A B-1B Lancer, one of the most formidable strategic bombers ever built, a supersonic aircraft designed during the Cold War to penetrate Soviet air defenses and capable of carrying more than 56 tons of weapons, had conducted strike missions over Iran and was returning home. But it could not fly over France, it could not fly over Spain, it could not fly over Portugal. All three had closed or effectively restricted their airspace to American offensive operations. So the bomber was forced into a massive detour over the Atlantic, burning additional fuel, requiring additional aerial refueling, adding hours to its mission before it could finally land at RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom. The most powerful military in human history, flying in circles because its allies had closed the door. That image was not just logistically significant, it was historically unprecedented in a way that I think is not being appreciated enough. Because here is what most people forgot. In 2003, when the United States and the UK invaded Iraq, France and Germany had opposed that war furiously. Dominique de Villepin had made his famous speech at the UN Security Council. Germany had refused to join. But even then, even at the peak of transatlantic fury over Iraq, Paris had allowed American and British aircraft to use its airspace. De Villepin himself had told the French Parliament at the time, "There are practices between allies that exist that we must respect, including overflight rights." In 2026, that particular practice was no longer being respected. The deterioration of the transatlantic relationship had reached a point where France was prepared to do something it had not done even in its most defiant moments of the previous 20 years. The airspace was closed, the door was shut, the detour was real. Germany's response was perhaps the most diplomatically precise of all the major European actors. Chancellor Merz had been the first European leader to visit Trump at the White House after the war began, a gesture that Washington interpreted as solidarity. But when Trump called for NATO allies to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz to escort oil tankers through the Iranian blockade, Berlin's answer was categorical. A spokesperson for Merz's government said, "NATO is an alliance to defend the alliance area. The United States did not consult us before this war, so we believe this is not a matter for NATO or the German government." Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul was even more precise at a European Union foreign ministers meeting in Brussels. "We need more clarity here. We expect from the US and Israel to inform us, to include us into what they're doing there, and to tell us if these goals are achieved." The word that hung over all of these statements, unspoken but unmistakable, was legitimacy. These governments did not believe the war was legitimate. They did not believe they had any obligation to support an action they had not been consulted on, did not endorse, and in several cases had publicly characterized as illegal under international law. Trump's response to the collective European refusal on the Hormuz coalition was one of the most revealing moments of his entire presidency. He had spent several days insisting that other nations needed to send warships to the strait. He had told reporters aboard Air Force One that he was demanding CETIO. He had warned in a Financial Times interview that NATO faced a very bad future if countries failed to police the strait. And then, on March 17th, sitting in the Oval Office with Ireland's Taoiseach for St. Patrick's Day, he said, "We don't need too much help. We don't need any help, actually." One day he was demanding. The next day he needed nothing. It was a whiplash that told you everything about the strategic coherence, or lack of it, in Washington's approach to alliance management. But he had also said something else, something that deserved to be taken more seriously than most analysts were taking it. He had said, whether we get support or not, I can say this, and I said it to them, we will remember. We will remember. That was not a rhetorical flourish, that was a ledger entry, and there was reason to take the threat seriously, because Rubio had already said the words out loud. The relationship with NATO needed to be reviewed. This is the breaking point that the mainstream conversation kept dancing around without naming directly. To understand what was truly at stake in the spring of 2026, you had to understand what the North Atlantic Treaty actually said and what it was designed to do. The alliance was founded in 1949 on a principle that was elegant in its simplicity. An attack on one member was an attack on all. Article 5 was the cornerstone. If the Soviet Union rolled tanks into West Germany, every member was obligated to respond. But Article 5 had always carried a quiet asymmetry at its heart. It obligated members to come to the defense of an ally under attack. It said nothing, nothing at all, about what to do when the most powerful member launched a war on its own initiative and then demanded that everyone else fall in line. That asymmetry had never mattered much before because no American president had previously started a war without at least attempting to build some form of coalition. Even the most controversial American military actions of recent decades had involved either formal coalition building, UN resolutions, or at minimum extensive diplomatic consultation with key allies before the first bombs fell. February 28, 2026 was categorically different. The decision to strike Iran was made in Washington and Jerusalem. NATO was informed, not consulted. Europe woke up to a war it had not been part of deciding, and then Washington asked for help. The European response? Spain and France closing airspace and bases, Germany and the UK declining to join offensive operations, the EU collectively finding no appetite for the Hormuz mission, was not, as Trump characterized it, a failure of allied solidarity. It was a constitutional crisis for the alliance itself. What happened when the fundamental premise of the relationship, shared decision-making, shared values, shared risk, was unilaterally abandoned by the most powerful member? The honest answer was that nobody knew, because it had never happened before. Not every NATO member followed the same path. Romania agreed to allow the United States to use its bases for Iran-related missions, a country on the eastern flank that couldn't afford to alienate its security guarantor against Russia. Turkey, meanwhile, intercepted Iranian missiles that entered its airspace on 3 separate occasions, but refused to join any offensive operations. Each government was running a different calculation, shaped by its geography, its history, and its specific degree of dependence on American power. Now let me tell you about a subplot that was receiving far less coverage than it deserved. On March 23, 2026, approximately 15 minutes before Trump posted that the United States and Iran were having very good and productive conversations, a post that caused oil prices to drop sharply, someone placed roughly $580 million in short positions on oil futures. 15 minutes before the post, not after, before. Congress began calling for a formal inquiry. Analyses showed Trump had developed a pattern of posting market-moving statements, specifically on Monday mornings, 2 hours before the stock exchange opened, in what looked like a deliberate attempt to calm investors before trading began. The pattern was Monday morning optimism post, markets calm, Iran denies everything, markets correct. Repeat the following Monday. It was either extraordinarily sophisticated market manipulation or the most extraordinary series of coincidences in recent financial history. The thread deserved far more oxygen than it was getting. Back to March 31st, back to that morning and those 6 words. Go get your own oil. Embedded in those words was something that went far beyond the Iran war. It was the explicit articulation of a doctrine that had been implicit in Trump's worldview since at least 2017. The United States would no longer serve as the guarantor of the rules-based international order. European security, European energy, European prosperity, these were now European problems. Washington had done its part, the bill was overdue. And if you hadn't shown up when America called, don't expect America to show up when you called. It was the most explicit statement of post liberal American foreign policy I had encountered. And it was written in all caps on a social media platform at 7 in the morning. That same morning, several things were happening simultaneously. In Dubai, Iran had struck a Kuwaiti crude oil tanker, the Al Salmi, a very large crude carrier loaded with 2 million barrels of oil destined for Qingdao, China, setting it ablaze in the harbor. Dubai residents had heard 5 explosions in the early hours. UAE air defenses had intercepted 11 ballistic missiles and 27 drones the night before. The Strait of Hormuz remained effectively closed to all but Chinese-flagged vessels, which Tehran was deliberately allowing through as a geopolitical signal. In Brussels, European foreign ministers were meeting to discuss the energy crisis caused by the blockade. In Washington, Congress was attempting to pass a war powers resolution that Trump would veto the moment it landed on his desk. Global oil was trading above $105 per barrel. Jet fuel had hit $200 in some Asian markets. Pakistan had declared a 4-day work week to conserve energy. Australian states were offering free public transport to offset fuel costs. The world was not watching a diplomatic spat. It was watching a structural rearrangement of the global order, playing out in real time. Marco Rubio gave an interview to Al Jazeera in the final days of March 2026 that I thought deserved far more attention than it received. He said that the relationship between the United States and NATO needed to be reviewed because of the alliance's position on the Iran war, and he framed it in terms that were worth examining carefully. His argument, stripped to its core, was this: you want Article 5 protection when your territory is threatened, but you weren't there when we needed you. How long can that asymmetry last? It was not an unreasonable question. The European response, that they were there for operations they considered legitimate, like Afghanistan, and that they weren't obligated to support wars they considered illegitimate, like this one, was also not unreasonable. Both positions had internal logic. The problem was that they were incompatible, and the alliance had no mechanism for resolving the incompatibility that didn't involve either one side backing down or the relationship fundamentally changing. Here is the uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to say out loud. Trump was not entirely wrong that there had been a structural imbalance in the alliance for decades. European countries had for years relied on American security guarantees while spending far less than Washington on defense. That imbalance was real. Trump's characterization of it as freeloading was crude, but it wasn't entirely without foundation. But there was a version of correcting that imbalance that involved genuine partnership, consulting allies before launching wars, building coalitions, sharing decision-making, and a version that involved unilateral action followed by demands for retroactive compliance. Trump had chosen the second version, and in doing so, he had not solved the free rider problem. He had transformed it into a credibility problem. Because allies who were not consulted before a war began had no ownership of that war's objectives, and allies with no ownership of the objectives had no particular reason to support its conduct. The B-1B making its Atlantic detour because the Allies had closed their airspace was not a symbol of a temporary dispute. It was an image of a new geopolitical reality in which the United States and Europe were discovering in real time that they had fundamentally different ideas about what their relationship actually meant. Are we partners or are we protectorates? That was the question 2026 had forced into the open. And it was a question the Atlantic Alliance had been carefully avoiding for decades because the answer, whatever it was going to be uncomfortable. There were 4 possible trajectories I could see from where I was sitting, and they weren't mutually exclusive. The first was controlled damage. Trump backed down from his most extreme threats. Europe made enough symbolic concessions on the Hormuz to give Washington a face-saving narrative, and the alliance survived, battered, transactional, distrustful, but functionally intact. This was the most probable short-term outcome, but it bought time rather than resolved the underlying contradiction. The second was gradual American retrenchment. Washington reduced its military presence in Europe and made good on the implicit threat to downgrade Article 5 guarantees for countries that hadn't supported the Iran operation. This pushed Europe toward accelerating its own defense integration, a project that had been theorized about for decades but had never had sufficient urgency to actually build. The Iran war might have provided that urgency. The third was the scenario that kept strategists in Warsaw, Tallinn, and Riga awake at night. A credibility gap in American security guarantees opened space for Russian adventurism in Eastern Europe. The countries that needed the American umbrella most had largely supported Washington precisely because they couldn't afford to alienate their security guarantor. But if the alliance's credibility had been undermined by the broader European refusal to support the Hormuz operation, Moscow might read the moment as an opportunity. The fourth, the most ambitious and the least certain, was that the crisis accelerated the construction of genuine European strategic autonomy. Not just defense spending targets, but actual independent nuclear deterrence, an integrated European military command, and a European geopolitical identity capable of acting independently of Washington's preferences. It was the scenario France had been advocating since de Gaulle, that Germany had always found too provocative, and that smaller European nations had always found too frightening to embrace. But the Iran war had illustrated with brutal clarity what the absence of that autonomy meant in practice. When the crisis arrived, Europe was energy dependent on a strait it couldn't open, militarily reliant on a protector it hadn't consulted, and politically paralyzed between its values and its vulnerabilities. That was not a comfortable place to be. And discomfort, historically, has a way of generating change that decades of comfortable theory could not. I want to leave you with the image that stayed with me after all of this. A lone strategic bomber designed in the Cold War to threaten the Soviet Union, flying a long loop over the dark Atlantic, below the churning ocean, behind it the airspace of France, Spain, and Portugal closed. Ahead, a runway in Gloucestershire, hours away. The most sophisticated weapons system in the world, alone in the sky, burning extra fuel because the Allies it was built to protect had decided they wanted no part of what it was doing. That image wasn't just military, it was civilizational. It was the visual representation of a question the 20th century had never been forced to answer. What happens to an alliance when its purpose becomes contested by its own members? The Atlantic Alliance was built on a bet that the democracies of the Western world shared enough values, enough history, enough interest to subordinate some degree of national sovereignty to collective security decisions. That bet had survived decades of pressure. France's withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command in 1966, Vietnam, Iraq, years of disputes over defense spending. What the Iran war of 2026 did was put that foundational bet directly in question. Not because Europe had turned against America, but because America had acted in a way that made European leaders wonder, publicly and explicitly, whether the alliance was something they were genuinely part of, or something they were merely protected by, on terms they had not agreed to and could not influence. That was the question Trump's 6 words had crystallized. And it was a question that was not going to be answered by a Truth Social post, or a Rubio interview, or a Starmer parliamentary statement, or a Brussels ministerial meeting. It was going to be answered slowly over years in decisions about defense budgets, diplomatic alignments, energy infrastructure, and weapons systems. It was going to be answered in the choices that 32 governments made day by day about which relationship to prioritize and which risk to absorb. That process was already underway, and the direction it was heading, toward a more fractured Atlantic, a more autonomous Europe, a more transactional America, was visible to anyone who had been paying attention to the signals over the past decade. The Iran war hadn't caused the fracture, it had just made it impossible to ignore. Go get your own oil, 6 words, 8 decades of alliance, and a question that was going to take a generation to answer. We'll keep watching it together. Episode by episode, conversation by conversation, coffee by coffee. See you next time.